on stage a panel discussion, Lean Thinking for Startup Founders. So I will call Matt Savas here to help out on this panel.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Savas. I'm the Director of Content for the Lean Enterprise Institute, and I'm so pleased to host this panel discussion today. Joining me is Matthew May and Pablo Dominguez from venture capital firm Insight Partners, and Arnaldo Camuffo, who I think many of you heard from earlier this morning from the University of Bocconi in Italy. What we'll be talking about today is applying lean thinking or versions of it for startups, entrepreneurs, both early stage and mid-stage startup companies, specifically around some of the ideas in Matt and Pablo's new book, What a Unicorn Knows, How Leading Entrepreneurs Use Lean Principles to Drive Sustainable Growth. Because this is a panel discussion, I'll invite everybody in the audience, and I do think we have close to 1,000 people with us right now, to post questions for our panelists in the chat, and I'll do my best to scroll through them and answer as many as we can in the short 30 minutes that we have. But to get things started, I will give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Matt. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt May. My background, very quickly, is that I spent the better part of a decade with Toyota Motor Sales here in the United States. I was attached to the University of Toyota. My job was to run improvement teams and also take the principles and tenets of the Toyota way to outside entities in much the same way a Disney Institute or Ritz-Carlton would do. For the last 10 years, I have been working with Pablo Dominguez to apply lean thinking principles to the digital world, startup world, software world, and that brings us to today.
Thanks, Matt. And your partner, Pablo.
Hey, everybody. Pablo Dominguez, operating partner at Insight Partners, venture capital firm that invests in software businesses. I've spent the better part of my entire career in sales and marketing, go-to-market effectiveness, and to Matt's point, I've been leveraging lean principles in sales and post-sales organizations for the last 12 years, and excited to share how the typical lean manufacturing process can translate over into startup, scale-up companies in the tech sector.
And Arnaldo, I know some of you will be hearing Arnaldo's introduction for a second time, but for those who haven't heard it, Arnaldo.
Okay, good evening, good morning, or good afternoon to everyone. My name is Arnaldo Camuffo. I teach lean management at Bocconi University, Milan. I also founded a few years ago the Lean Management Institute in Italy. And being an MIT grad, I got the lean virus while participating into the International Motor Vehicle Program back in the 80s at MIT.
Thanks, Arnaldo. I think I'll kick things off. I think it's fitting to start with you, Arnaldo, because you've been doing research over the last few years on the application of scientific thinking to entrepreneurial decision-making. I hope I got that description correct. But essentially how to apply lean thinking to early-stage startups for founders. And you've done something sort of amazing where you gather cohorts of 100+ startups and separate them into a control group and a treatment group. So a randomized control trial, where one group, the control group, is getting something like the Eric Ries Lean Startup curriculum, and the treatment group is getting something a little bit more robust, maybe not a little bit more, maybe way more robust, around how to use PDCA or scientific thinking to eliminate bias, enhance quality decision-making in early-stage startups. But if you could you differentiate those two things so the audience can sort of better grasp what your research is all about, lean startup, Eric Ries model versus what that treatment group is getting inside your research?
Yes, I'm glad to share this. Currently, I mean, up to today, we have run or are running 16 randomized control trials around the world, including countries like Tanzania, Colombia, obviously several European countries, China, twice in India, and by now we have made interventions on early stage startups that amounted to a couple of thousands. And the idea at the beginning was really to test the lean startup method. But while we were piloting this research project, we also realized that there was something unaccounted for in this approach, which is basically what in statistics and decision science is called type 3 error or model specification. And we realized that many of the companies that were applying this method were really super active and super quick in running experiments and learning and pivoting, etc. But some of these actually resulted in waste. Okay, this idea of blind search, this idea of failing quickly, failing often, was somewhat wasteful. And instead, also going back to our readings of the Toyota's prescription, especially the literature about Hoshinkari and the A3 method, we realized that there's one part which was unaccounted for, and the idea of how you frame the problem, you define the problem. And there's multiple ways of framing and defining the problems. And if you solve the wrong problem, you can do a lot of experiments on things that are irrelevant or not helpful. And so we designed basically different versions of pre-acceleration programs. And by randomizing early stage startups into them, we try to figure out which of these versions, more experimental or more, let's say, guided by problem definition, would be better conducive of performance, not only in terms of revenues and time to revenue, but for instance, also in terms of quitting, of abandoning, of terminating the projects, because we think that one important result, one important outcome of the application of these different entrepreneurial methods is also the ability to detect early problems. Let me just give you a final insight of the results of this research. We typically expect that pivoting is something good and effective because it underlines learning. In reality, what we found is that those who were trained with the full, quote, full scientific treatment that were spent some time in actually identifying what was, what were the future states that were envisioning in a solid way, etc., they would pivot more selectively, okay? They would be more likely to pivot, but made less pivot than the lean startups.
I'm curious to hear from Matt and Pablo. I mean, your firm houses several hundred startup companies, many of those in the early stages. And is what Arnaldo is saying resonating with what you see, where startups are maybe more eager to fail fast versus focus on in getting the problem definition correct?
I'll start. Failure is never the goal. So we don't start from, hey, fail fast is good. When I spent time at Toyota, that was never the goal. You can't help but fail if you're experimenting constantly. What we do in the program that we have at Insight Partners is called the Lean Scale Up. And I take what I learned at Toyota, which is kind of traditional lean principles, but translate them in a palatable way for software professionals so that they can make the mental leap between, many of the things that have been presented this morning, traditional widget kinds of processes, but apply it to software, product design, development, and go to market. And we take them through a simulation of the Toyota production system, but we don't pound them over the head, with Japanese terminology, with, kind of doctrinaire approaches to lean. They learn the way on the way in a quick half-hour, half-day simulation. And then we take them through the scientific method, although I don't call it plan, do, check, act. I use language that they're familiar with. It is a design process. It is quite, parallel in terms of what happened. We set goals, we map the current situation, we identify a problem statement, we root cause it, understand the impact of that on the business, oftentimes in terms of revenue or lost productivity. Then we will, after we root cause it, then we'll move into the future state, understanding then what would have to be true for a solution or countermeasure being proposed to work. And that helps us craft up an experiment. And that actually alleviates some of the things I think that Arnaldo has has observed in kind of the lean startup method versus more of the traditional way. And I'll let Pablo weigh in on how that's actually landed on our portfolio companies.
Yeah, and other Matt, we have about 507 portfolio companies, right? Globally, international and US. And from a go-to-market perspective, which was what Matt was taking, it's actually fascinating to take a manufacturing concept and sort of apply it to business. In sales, time to value is critical, right? Getting a customer to purchase your solution and then up and running and using it so that there is value created so they continue to purchase and then renew when the contract is up to continue to purchase is even critical, right? So a lot of companies struggle with going live on their solution. And so we've applied the lean principles to streamline not only the selling process, but also the post-sales process, right? Implementation, billing, et cetera, where on average, we're taking out 25% of waste in the entire selling process to decrease time to value by 25%. Like that's honestly the minimum. That's the worst that Matt and I have done in working with portfolio companies is taking out a quarter of the waste. We had one portfolio company that took out 66% of the waste in the process in terms of time to value, which if you think about it, you're selling millions of dollars a year. You can reduce the cycle time by 66%. That is huge in terms of revenue generated.
Do you find it challenging to dig into the details with these companies, operational details? How do you convince these young companies that it's worthwhile to spend time digging into a customer journey at that level of detail?
I don't find it hard just simply because we've been doing this so long that typically when someone says, hey, here's the issue, and we can bring you examples, hey, Matt and I have done this for 30 or 40 other companies, and here's been the results, talk to the CEO, they immediately say, hey, sign me up, right? And the way that Matt has designed the engagement is we're basically bringing teams from cross-functional parts of the organization together, right? So, hey, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, your teams are going to come together, right? Get trained on lean principles, map out the existing process. And mind you, sometimes these people have not ever met before, right? So they're coming together from all different parts of the world, from marketing, from sales, from product engineering, legal, HR, for the first time to talk about things that they all are touching, but they're not aware of what somebody else is doing, right? They're focused on their own little world. And then those same people come up with the recommended solution that then gets presented to, the CEO, the C-suite, for us to then go and MVP. So once people see that process, they're actually very supportive of it because it's a good way to build stronger collaboration between teams, but it's also something that they build, not Matt or I.
Also, the importance, it sounds, of leading with the problem to solve versus the tool itself. We're going to map a customer journey, not to just map the customer journey, but because we know we could shrink the lead time from first touch to sale. I'd like to aim the next question again at Matt and Pablo. In your book, you have something called the SCALE framework. We don't have enough time in this conversation to dig into all of it, but I'd like to start with the first letter in the framework, which is strategic speed. And you say that sort of counters the force of drag or the inability to respond to rapidly changing market forces. Early stage startup, you have a few people, not so hard to change direction, align a small team around that direction. But once you start adding people to the organization, start to build governance structures around it, it becomes increasingly complex to not just respond to changing market forces, but maybe even harder to align the organization around a new direction. How do you tackle that problem inside of these scaling startups?
Yeah, good question. And I think that I'm sure your audience is more than familiar with the notion of Hoshin Kanri. In the tech world, we call that OKRs, objectives and key results. But basically the notion of having very, very clear choices being made at the top level and then having functions that support and are subordinate to the corporate strategy hanging from that like a mobile, and then having quarterly targets and objectives and results that are measured to deploy that strategy. So it's nothing that probably this audience hasn't heard before, the notion of cascading strategies and goals. The difference might be that we use a very powerful but simple framework. It's not our own. It's called the Playing to Win framework. It was popularized by Roger Martin during his time at Monitor, and he and his co-author wrote a book called Playing to Win, his co-author being the very famous A.G. Lafley of Procter & Gamble fame. And it's a quite simple framework. And the reason that that's important, and the questions are very quickly, what's our winning aspiration? Where will we play? How will we win? What capabilities do we need? And what systems are required? The magic in that framework is, number one, that it's simple. Everyone can understand those kinds of questions. Number two, that all of those choices are integrated. So they all have to support each other. If you have a capability, a better map to how to win a competitive advantage in a given space. But we also talk about some of the things that Arnaldo is getting to, which is, what are the assumptions underlying this strategy? What are the things that would have to be true for that strategy to work, because it deals with the future? Once you get that clarity up top, it becomes that much easier to get it at the next level. So, and in the Toyota world, it's very much horizontal, vertical, all the way back up, so that all of those things hang together. Once you've got that, and it doesn't take very long to do once you have a powerful framework, then decision-making speeds up. The notion of drag being these, long, drawn-out strategic planning sessions that can often take months. By the time you finish some of those planning sessions, the world has moved on. You think about 2 years ago, 2020, had we spent 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks coming up with a strategic plan, oh my gosh, it would be kind of useless by the time, this pandemic hit. So constantly understanding the assumptions underlying our choices. So all of that reduces drag. All of that allows us to make quicker decisions, and decisions that run up and down the company so that it's aligned, just like a peloton in the cycling world, a flock of geese in the Hoshin Conry way. So that was a long explanation to your question, but that's how it works.
I'd like to ask Arnaldo, what we're talking about is not just clarity and alignment around a strategy, but having a good strategy, one that's going to work in the marketplace. And Arnaldo, how do you, if you're Eric Ries, they say you got to get out of the building. I'm curious, what are the methods that you teach that treatment group so that they're able to test their assumptions, so that the strategy that they ultimately align around is one that's going to work, or more likely to work than not?
This is a very interesting question, because typically what I see often done in most of, for instance, business schools, but also in common practice, is the standard application of standard tools like the business model canvas or other things, right? And people actually start from there, right? And they compile it, and they that's obviously very helpful, because people have a tool to start with, or similar ones. But in the end, I'm not sure. The advantages of having an actionable routine offsets the disadvantage of letting off the shoulders of the founders the burden of actually asking the questions, right? Of actually building their own models, of building the future states, of questioning the beliefs they have about what's going to happen. I have this technology, okay, let's say a ventilating rubber shoe sole, okay, and I think that there's a market there, and I'm using here an example of that. It's a famous Italian company that has done that. There's a market there. This is an assumption, okay? There's a causal link. If I do this, that will happen, okay? And by the way, if I can patent it, the competition will not enter, et cetera, and this will. So the question here is, what am I leaving out of this, okay? While instead, typically founders tend to say, this is the world I want to build, and this is the world where I will commit, and this is where I will bet my money, okay? While instead, there's another point in time here where you need first to say, am I sitting on the right model? Are these states that I'm foreseeing plausible? What are the conceptual experiments that I can do? Who are the people I can talk to build more confidence on this, so that my beliefs are not only the results of my motivation, my confidence, my determination, but it's something else. And there's different ways to to help founders do this, we use this tool, which is called the story tree. We are using now Bayesian networks, which allow also not only to define the conceptual structures, but also, to actually elicit really what are the probabilities, the subjective beliefs around this, and it's extremely powerful, right? And we think that scientific founders, from this standpoint, are a little slower to go a little faster, which is another, kind of teaching that Toyota offered us.
I'd like to step into sort of the operational realm and look to Pablo for this next question. But you're aligned around a strategy, but at the same time, you want to continue to foster a creative environment inside your company, keep it dynamic. But how do you, one way to do that is continuous improvement. Now, how do you make sure that the improvement that is taking place inside the organization is aligned around that strategy? How do you, what's a method for ensuring that people aren't just improving whatever for improvement's sake, but actually making gain towards an organization's objective?
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that, because Matt tries to hold us accountable all the time for that, in terms of improvement for the sake of improvement is not, it's waste in essence, right? And so for the organizations where we teach them the lean principles, right, and we want them to consider, constant experimentation, improvement of existing processes, challenging the status quo. Again, it goes back to our first point in the book, right, in terms of aligning to the strategy and the OKRs, right? If the company strategy is to accomplish X, and these are the objectives we're going to align on as a organization at the highest level, and then at the functional level, then are the activities that we are doing within different teams aligning to those objectives, which ultimately align to the strategy, right? So it's making sure that we are not doing things that don't help us either drive growth, profitability, whatever those strategic pillars might be, right? If we're going into a new market, is the team that's working on going into a market doing things that achieve those outcomes, right? That we aligned on from a strategic perspective. So again, it's as simple as making sure you have a North Star and making sure everybody is aligned on what it takes to get to that North Star.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to say that, to add to that, one of the things that we regularly do, and we do that in our own teams as well as those with our portfolio companies, but the notion of, and this may be a difference between OKRs and Hoshinkanri, I think, in a sense, at least the way I learned Hoshinkanri. A good objective and key result is set at a stretch level, meaning success is 60-70% completion is considered successful. Well, what does that mean? That means that you are setting an aggressive target to move a strategy forward that requires different thinking. You can't help but think innovatively, and the lifeblood of innovation and innovative thinking is experimentation. So we try and make the notion of experimentation the default. Like, you can't do your work without it, right? So, and that's kind of built into and by design. So even when we set targets with our improvement teams and portfolio companies, we start at that 20. Don't give me a number that's south of 25% improvement in something, because that's going to translate to people working longer, staying later, and that's not thinking smarter. That's not thinking more creatively. So we try and flip the default, so you can't avoid it.
So interesting, using the problem statement not just to align the organization, but challenge the organization to think differently. It's amazing how quickly time goes. We have about 5 minutes left. I did want to ask a question for, the audience is probably not from an early stage or mid-stage startup. Most here are from mature organizations. And so I would like to ask, starting with Arnaldo, what are some lessons from these early stage startup companies that somebody in a mature organization can use effectively?
Thank you for the question. This is really something that we, with our research group, have talked a lot and reflected a lot. And the best metaphor that we came up is with the Drosophila melanogaster, right? It's like startups have a clock speed that is much faster than established firms. So what you can test and understand from the decision they make, the way they make it, is really, really insightful so for instance, this idea of that startups tend to make a lot of false positives. It's immediately you can immediately see there. It takes more time because there's more infrastructure, etc., in an established firm. But I think that's something that, for instance, applies. The same concept applies to the idea that also Pablo was developing earlier. So this idea, for instance, that you run experiments and you document and you improve quickly, and you can do that because again, it's either you make it or you fail. But I see that this is not only because you're more efficient, you convert more, you get to the targets, etc. But I think it's also because you let the founders, especially in the scale-up phase, to have more time to really think what are the big things, the big decisions, the fundamental aspects, the capital structure, and where they're going to get the money, and what is going to be the next move, etc., which otherwise are crowded out by these more high-frequency, low-impact decisions. In established firm, this is the norm. Okay, you have a lot of things that drag you down, of problems that come back there, etc., and you cannot carve out time to really tackle the low frequency, high impact decisions that instead are going to shape the destiny of your firm.
And last question here for Matt and Pablo. As we look ahead, the economic environment continues to be extremely volatile. The past few years have been tremendously uncertain for a number of reasons, hence the theme of this year's event. But looking ahead, people are forecasting an economic downturn. I'm curious, what advice are you giving for your companies that are at that stage where they're looking to grow rapidly in this kind of uncertain environment?
Yeah, I mean, we're literally dealing with this now, right? Because our role is to advise our portfolio companies on how to scale. And Matt is in the thick of a ton of lean engagements. One, because companies have to do more with less, right? I may have just had to exit some people, right, that were doing certain tasks before. My sales process is elongating because now finance and procurement and large enterprise companies are getting involved. And so this is a perfect time to reevaluate your entire lead to cash process, right, for a company to figure out where can I gain efficiencies, right? Where can I eliminate waste because I've got potentially less people, less capital. I've got to be more efficient. So our advice is hunker down, like let's focus on what we can control, get more efficient. And, to Matt's point on strategy, figure out where to play, right? A lot of companies are trying to do too many things at once, go into different markets, roll out new products, do this and that. And during these turbulent times, it's very critical to be very focused on what are you good at and not try to cover too many things and spread yourself too thin.
I'll give Matt the last minute.
Well, to that point, I think we often lose when we talk about lean and where it comes from and how it's tied to the Toyota world and the Toyota production system. I think we often lose what Pablo was just talking about, which is the Toyota production system. The secret is that it was never about really quality, reliability, dependability, all those kinds of things. It was how do we get from order to cash? If you look at the, you read Taiichi Ohno's work, it was how do we shrink that cycle? And that is all about our work, whether the economy is up or down. There's never really anything bad about taking that approach of how do we shrink the time to value and capturing that value, delivering that value, and never forget that. Order to cash is it. So in times of hardship like this, that's where we hunker down. That's where we make sure that if we're, delivering value to our customers and we're clear on what that value is and we're shrinking that time, good things are going to happen.
Thanks for a wonderful discussion, Matt, Pablo, and Arnaldo. So appreciate you joining us here at the Lean Global Connection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you, Matt.